Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of RevOps Live. Today, we bring you an exciting conversation on data-driven RevOps and revenue intelligence. This is around the criticality of just the core data and its hygiene, the common data languages, and frankly, how does this translate to pipeline health? And frankly, taking that level of shared metrics to bridge finance, revenue leaders, and the operational initiatives that you're driving on a day-to-day basis. And so to help us discuss this, to deep dive into this world of RevOps, we have Janis Zech, CEO of Weflow, and we're going to unpack some of these game-changing strategies for data-driven success. Welcome, Janis. Could you take just a minute or two to just give us a quick introduction to who you are so we understand where you're coming from?
Sounds great. Thanks for having me. I'm Janis. I'm a founder for the last 15 years. So I've started 3 companies. Weflow is my 3rd company. The first one I grew from pretty much 0 to 225 million in gross revenue, 350 people. We sold it at some point, then invested with a venture fund called Point 9 Capital while starting my 2nd company, which then got bought by Personio. And the 3rd one is now Weflow, which essentially is on a mission to make the entire forecasting process really easy and data-driven. And we'll talk a lot more about that. But yeah, really happy to be here and share some of our learnings with the audience.
Well, you certainly bring a unique perspective, the investor, the operator, and this idea of forecast and the idea of using data, just really bringing these things together. And actually such a great topic for us to jump into since it's right at the core of RevOps. When we think about building a successful RevOps strategy, it often comes down to balancing that top-down, finance-driven forecast with a bottoms-up sales execution. How do you see these two approaches coming together to create a more of that comprehensive view of the business, and what role does Rev Intelligence and pipeline management play in aligning these perspectives?
Yeah, fantastic question. So, I think every company goes through this annual planning cycle, and I think most companies are actually starting this right now. And whether you like it or not, it's essentially the process of figuring out where you'll end next year, and more importantly, to essentially present a budget to the board, right? And this is a formal process that everybody has to go through. And ideally, the FP&A, right, so the finance side and the RevOps side are closely aligned and agree on the basically underlying bottom-up metrics that drive the forecast for the annual year. The challenge, and I think we've lived through this the last couple of years, especially if the market environment changes, right? It's really, really hard to plan out for a year, especially on the revenue side. And then I think the other piece is that often it's not just the company planning, but there's essentially a board of directors that has a certain plan for the company. And especially if you look at high growth, software as a service companies or technology companies, right? They often, have ideas about what they need to achieve to essentially be fundable or achieve the next milestone of funding versus the reality of the business. And that is often a really challenging balancing act. I think every listener has been living through this. And so I think like that's basically the challenge, right? How do you do this well? I think we've probably spent, hours talking about this, but yeah, I think this is like the overarching challenge that most finance and RevOps teams are facing. And even more importantly, like the question of alignment and the data that they are using for these models.
Well, you're absolutely spot on. That alignment is so key, and key to that is just showing clear lines of progress against the financial goals, and aligning those sales teams' definitions, and frankly simplifying the collection to deliver not just data but insights into what's driving results. I'm sure you've heard the same. My old CFOs at various companies have been, hey, if you could just keep Salesforce, that system of record, I wouldn't have to try to roll it up and create my own data records to see what's really going on in the business. But that said, that brings me to one of my questions that I've got. Why, when you think about Salesforce, why is Salesforce data hygiene crucial for revenue operations? What's that clean backbone for effective RevOps?
I think when you think about data, I think there's like essentially 4 layers of that, right? So data, reporting, insights, and prediction, right? And they are actually layered in that sense. And so obviously the number one goal should be, okay, how do you have a system of truth that enables you to properly report and have consistency in your reporting? And then, from there you level up into insights and being able to predict, right? So it's kind of do the, report the news in a way that is really, really good. And then, try to gain insights that, help you to take action and then be able to predict. All this is essentially based on the data quality and hygiene. And I think, Salesforce is one example, right? Like you could also build like a data warehouse and, bring a lot of data together there. I think there's a big debate in RevOps, like the pros and cons. But the reality is, and I think we face this basically with all our customers, that most Salesforce instances have pretty poor data hygiene, right? And I think the fundamental, like one fundamental, job for RevOps is to actually become really good at automating, simplifying, and streamlining the data collection side. And so as the basically ground layer of everything I said, afterwards.
Oh, spot on. And frankly, I think it's going to be very hard, especially as we're seeing, the rise of, revenue platforms or other types of things, to see whether it can be kept in one place. And so how do you keep that common data backbone? Listen, hey, like to your point, if your CRM data is a mess, your forecasting, reporting, and decision-making are all going to be compromised. And that's absolutely true. But, let's get to the second question then, which is, standardizing metrics and KPIs. Even as we try to get that top down connected with the bottoms up, that connection is such a key to alignment. Janis, how can revenue leaders establish a common data language within their organization? And that actually helps put some of the goals in place in terms of actually where should I hold that record of truth?
Yeah. I think that's another fantastic question and so important because, I think there's data where you can basically automate the collection, right? So emails, meetings, contact data, right? You should automate that. There's enough tools out there where you can basically do that. Then there is certain data points that are actually really based on your definitions, right? So I give you a very specific example that has a big impact and a lot of people in RevOps think about, but in sales and often customer success for renewal and expansion might not think about as hard. But when do you open an opportunity? And then what are the different sales stages? How do you ensure that you have good, entry and exit criteria? What is your methodology, your framework to qualify? And how do you make sure that you capture that data? Because if you think about what that means, it has an impact on your win rate, your conversion rates. It has an impact on sales cycle length, right? So it has an impact on, and that essentially layers up and, goes back to what we initially talked about, hits the top-down model of the CFO, right? So it's all connected. It's just different layers, right? Like so if you don't like make sure that you have a clear definitions that are not just written somewhere in a wiki, but that are actually consistently lived. And I think that is the really challenging part. How do you make sure that your kind of metric and definitions are not just stored centrally, but actually lived by the team, where you rely on the team to do proper data collection. And then I think the other piece of it is the reporting layer, right? Where I think there's like an over supply of reports that fly around and people actually don't know what's going on, right? And simple tricks would be, okay, document where you find what reports and ensure that, every time somebody asks you for a report, you send back that definition or that guide, and you also, link to that report instead of always creating new, right? But, right, like, or do less and more focused, right? So really focus on less reports that are more insightful, and then, refer back to those and enable the team to actually understand the reports, right? I think that we always, and I think this is also the big challenge for RevOps and sales ops, and however you call it, right? Like that you take for granted that everyone has the same degree of understanding of the metrics, but the reality is it's not the case, right? And there's a huge variance of understanding of the metrics, and so you need to make sure that you work with the teams to enable them to understand the reports, to understand the insights, and to basically derive action from those, because it's not about the data, right? It's about the action that helps you have more revenue impact, but the data is the foundation.
Well, I mean, I think you said a couple key things there. I mean, one clearly is getting everyone on the same definitions. And this is such a key role for the ops person, which is creating that level of alignment because of the shared insights, the shared dashboards that everyone's using. If anything, that word of shared, making sure people really understand the data, gets into one of the issues I constantly hear complaints from RevOps, which is I get asked for 100 reports and no one uses them.
Yeah.
Right. Part of that is getting back to the idea of, do they really understand how it applies to the top-down metrics to hit our goals? And are we measuring the right things? And therefore, are we all now using it? And that's institutionalizing, really operationalizing the data, the collection of that data, and making sure we understand the stages in the right way. Although, when you think about the benefits, just so we can nail it there, what do you see as some of the the big benefits of standardized metrics and KPIs?
Well, I think it goes down to running a repeatable cadence where everyone looks at the same thing again and again. And like, if you think about reporting, right? If you constantly change your sales process, or if you think about or you change the definitions, the problem is you cannot compare to historic benchmarks, right? So like your historic data is essentially becoming worthless because you cannot compare. And then external benchmarks are often like hard to compare with because they might be exactly like you, but maybe it's not an apples to apples comparison, right? So I think it's really like, on the data collection side, the question, what data is worth, collecting? It's not about all data is equal, right? So prioritizing. Then on the reporting side, it's like, what are the few things that everybody looks at throughout the quarter that essentially enables decision making and action, right? So what do you look at in your deal reviews? What do you use in your forecast meetings, right? So make it very practical instead of abstract. And then I think there's another, and this is, if you look at the maturity model of RevOps teams, right? At some point in time, you want to have deeper analytic and business intelligence capabilities, from a technical perspective, right? But also from a people's perspective, to dive deeper, because at some point of the organization, it's not 100% clear why things are like they are. So you need a better level of diagnosis. And that is essentially, it's a different maturity level. It's different to providing the few reports that power, or the few, data points that power the day-to-day rhythm. But it's also like really insightful. And I think it's a great way of RevOps actually creating more strategic value, because we all sit behind basically all the go-to-market craziness that's happening every day, right? And we can look at, where are the gaps, where's the revenue dropping out of the funnel, where are things that are inefficient, and do that on a data driven, on a very metrics driven perspective, and then bring that back to the executive team, right, with deeper insights, and essentially see if you can develop programs or projects out of those, and essentially change them, or also say, okay, look, we know we could be better there, but it's not a top 5 priority right now, right? So yeah, that's a long-winded answer of okay,
No, I mean, but you spot on. If there's one thing that keeps coming up is, how does a RevOps person elevate? I mean, today, so many of them that we speak to consider themselves almost a service desk. Request, this report, connect this, run this. And frankly, to get above, you said the right words, strategic insight. And this is when, what is the right things for us to look at? How do we actually think about comparability, especially when things are changing as fast as they are today? And so it does start, though, with something that sounds very common, very kind of low level, which is a common data language. And I think you're hitting on the right point, which is this ensures everyone's on the same page, but also is one of your building blocks as an ops leader to start getting to that level of shared insights that you can then bring insight back to, and therefore prioritization, and be part of the strategic conversations about what are the things we should be doing next. Sorry, Janis, did I cut you off?
I just want to add. I just want to add one thing there, because so when I started my first company, I was a big proponent of KPIs, right? So key performance indicators, and to essentially set them as a company. And I think every company should have them. And so I think when you think about this, initial discussion, finance, and ops, how they work together, I think there's almost like a KPI tree, right? So you essentially have the lagging indicators that are often, the typical SaaS metrics, right? Year-on-year ARR growth, NRR, GRR, rule of 40, like the things that, are used to evaluate and value SaaS companies, as an example. And then you have essentially input metrics that essentially, drive those things, right? Like, and so I think, developing these kind of KPI trees, from a RevOps perspective, because often when you do it in finance, they stop there, right? They stop basically at the SaaS metrics. And I think it's also changing, right? I think the great CFOs, there, go-to-market CFOs, they're a lot closer to the reality of them.
They have much more
exactly. It's super important, right? It's in the end, it's all one team. It should all have the same mission, but at the same time, I think it's a great way for RevOps to elevate, not just on the analytics side, but really like, okay, what are the KPIs, and then how do you monitor the KPIs, and how do you flag, essentially shortcomings, so that you have basically better prediction and reaction to gaps you're observing, right? And this can be pipe gen, it can be pipe conversion, it can be, expansion and renewal, but it's almost like you're basically building your flight simulator, and you know exactly where you're going, what you're doing, and all the knobs and technical input details you can basically use to change the course and the destination.
Well, I think people what RevOps teams often forget, and I've used this word, we'll see if you agree with it. I would say RevOps teams are actually the product managers of your go-to-market motion. I know it can be controversial. I've got a lot of people say, no, that's not it at all, because they don't own it. I'm like, it's true. They're like independent press. We have the Democrats and the Republicans here in the US, getting a little controversial, but you do need an independent press that is actually thinking about what are the things that we should all be viewing as shared truths. And that gets to a little bit of the role of RevOps, to actually having that perspective across the entire business, which very few folks besides the CEO and the CFO really have. So what you're saying is spot on. But let's get to how do we make it happen, because we've talked about the data quality and the core, which then gets to this common data language and this tree of metrics. But let's talk about the role of automation in capturing some of this data, and frankly, what does that mean towards enhancing productivity to be able to execute on some of the data and some of the insights that's coming out?
Yeah, look, I mean, so we actually lived through this firsthand. The kind of the way to capture CRM data specifically, I think ideally is as much automated as possible. And so I think the reality is that you want to automate email, meeting, contact capture. You want to automate the enrichment. You want to have, all the conversation and transcript data. Ideally automate, the methodologies you're using, whether that's Medpic, Medic, Spiced, or a combination of those. And then also kind of the warning signals and insights that help the team to, identify risk, flag risk, And then the same is true. And this basically then goes into the reporting layer, the insights layer, and the forecasting layer, right? So that's the way how we think about it. Like, it ideally should all be automated, because the reality is that, it's like salespeople, CS people, SDRs, BDRs, they all have a lot to do, and they all hate manual data entry. And it just often doesn't happen. And I think it's, like, I mean, it's a bit like, I think it's, I don't blame them for it. Who likes manual data entry, right?
Look, hey, we all know I spent my time in ops as well. We know if there's a pick list that's more like 3 or 4, the sales guys, just pick the first one. How come everyone is automotive industry, for instance? So let's drill down a little bit more, which is, we have a lot of recent innovations, sales and sales ops automations and capturing sales activities. What are some, specific tools and technologies that you've seen proven effective? For instance, one of the things that we've been doing with customers is, how do you actually look at all the different meetings people have had and just extract who else was on that meeting? Because the sales guys haven't entered anyone else except for like one person on that meeting. In fact, the IT guy was there, the finance person was there. Now by extracting that, putting that against the opportunity, flagging that as a systems generated thing, you actually have visibility to the buying group. And we all know, just that data starts really helping understand where you really are in the cycle. Can you share any specific tools, technologies, or what you're seeing in terms of things that are proving effective?
Yeah, no, I think so. So look, I mean, obviously, I'm very biased because we're building Weflow. We have an alternative to Einstein Activity Capture, and it does exactly what you just mentioned. It connects to Microsoft or Google Workspace, automatically captures emails, meetings, and then also the contact data. So who is being added to a thread, who is being added in a meeting, stores that in Salesforce, so it's reportable. You own the data. It has actually, right, it's really just an integration layer. And it's, it's something that, like, usually is one way of automating. I think a second, topic is obviously conversations, right? So recording, transcribing, and then, making use out of the transcript. There's a lot of companies in that space that, essentially help you get better data quality. And that can be, pre or post sale. I think, on the kind of deduplication and enrichment layer, right, there's a lot of automation that, makes a lot of sense, right? So whether you look at companies like Clearbit or more top of the funnel, right, like everything from, Cognizant, Zoom Info, Apollo, to many others, right? And the requirements there are obviously different. I think there's still this, like, LinkedIn gap, right? So how do you make sure that you capture LinkedIn and WhatsApp data if that's relevant? I think call recording, like calling, right, like VoIP is just de facto standard. Everybody does it. Everything is automated in that sense. But I think really the biggest innovation I see is, how do you make better use of the conversations, and how do you essentially understand that data a lot better? And I think there's a variety of companies in that space as well. Probably I have many. These are the, like, very specific areas where, I, being very close on product, right, spend most of my time. So I think there's probably a lot more innovation happening right now.
Well, absolutely. And I think, we've been talking about the fact that you have your basic foundation. It's always funny to me, you break it down for sort of your data foundation, you have your signals that you're coming in, which we've been talking about. And that's where we're seeing a lot of innovation. And then, of course, how do you then elevate that up for that revenue intelligence side? That foundation of data hygiene, there is, not just about deduplication and sort of that enrichment. A lot of people still think data quality is a third party data quality. But really, how do you combine that and unify? So you can actually think about multiple sources, and actually treating your own first party data as another source to really get clarity on that data foundation that's shared. But then, like you said, how do you actually automate the collection of a ton of signals, and frankly, cut some of the signal to noise ratio so that you can elevate just what's really meaningful? Although, how do you think about, how automation really gets to, turned into healthy and consistent pipeline? I mean, there's a gap here from sort of foundational data, and we're very much in that RevOps data quality platform area. That signal to noise pieces. I know you guys are capturing a lot of signal. How do you turn that into something that is to ensure healthy and consistent pipeline?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, right? So I think, like there's different strategies out there how you do it, but specifically how we look at it is you want to make sure that like your CRM is your system of truth for all things pipeline. Um, but for example, right, so like what we do is we basically provide the layer to run your entire forecasting process. And in addition to the existing CRM fields, there's like signals that get put on top, right? Multi-threading, is their next meeting scheduled? Like, kind of how often was the close date pushed out, right? So like the basically leading indicators, right? Like, are you at power, right? Like, so there's so many specific examples that are very specific to your current sales motion and segment focus, that essentially help you understand: are you looking at healthy deals? Are you looking at healthy pipeline? And where do you and that then leads into the forecasting, right? And also forecasting the same thing, right? Like, we don't think of it as there's like this one final call, but it's more like, okay, what are the different input factors, dynamic weighted, bottom up, AI prediction, right? Like all the different factors that help you, give you a corridor of where you could land. And then you look at the data and you say, okay, but my judgment is this, right? But you want to make sure that you have that, uh, you know, based on the reality of the opportunities, and not just, some random spreadsheet where people put in their gut feeling and there's no accountability and commitment against that, right? So in our mind, it's not just, I mean, the data is the foundation, but then it's actually about the reports and insights that power the operating cadence that you run. And that operating cadence needs to be enabled in a way that it then helps you predict the outcome on a more accurate level. And so that's a very specific, I think, work, like a process that you run, and I think that most companies should run, or all companies should run. But obviously there's a lot more, right? That has nothing to do with how do you generate more pipeline.
And it's not always about more
and
pipeline, because to your point, we're all feeling it right now. And I think we're going to feel it for a little while longer, not to be a little bit depressing, but smaller pipes right now, in terms of coverage, we certainly have fewer salespeople and sales support. And so there's a lot of pressure right now to focus. And how am I focusing on the right things? And how am I therefore investing and knowing what's working and what's not working? And I think this is what we're starting to see. And I think what's interesting here, when you think about the role of automation and all this innovation we're seeing, is that by on one side you have to automate the mundane tasks, and that frees up your team to focus on more strategic activities and earn you some points, frankly, as a RevOps person, so that you can move on to as well. But this is a game changer for productivity, seller happiness, and personally, I also see this as shifting mindsets from the RevOps person as well. Don't just show 50 more fields on Salesforce where the AE has to read it, try to figure out what they're going to do with it. They have a lot of things going on. How do you actually synthesize this up so that that the AEs, the SDRs, very quickly see, where how they should decide what's real summarized guidance? And yes, you can expose 50 fields if you want to, but how do you make it fast so that they can see the insights and directions that your broader view across the revenue cycle is giving you, so that it takes some of their, to your point, gut instincts to something that's a little more exposed and more repeatable as a company.
But yeah, I think that's such a good point. And sometimes if you think about a cadence or a sequence, right, it's a set of tasks that SDRs and BDRs go through, and it's very clear what to do next. Whether the outcome is the right one or not is a different question, but it is very clear. If you think about pipeline management, it is absolutely all over the place, right? And so I think what we dream of is creating a system that has the data quality, so that you can surface insights at the right time, so that on a AE or AM or CSM level, you can actually do what you should do to close more deals. And that's absolutely part of the game. And then as a manager, I get basically the gaps flagged and the risks that essentially exist in the pipeline, so that I can essentially have the conversation to turn things around or move on and focus my time on other things. And I think that is essentially where we're all going. that the systems, based on better automated data and simplification, will help you make better decisions in the workflow. And that, I think, is real interesting system enablement versus you have a list and you sit in front of the list and you think about what would be potentially a good next step, and often it's all bloated and not super healthy, but it's still stuck there, which then totally kills your
And which
entire
can be very
go-to-market
specific
metrics.
as well as both more broad. I mean, very specific, you're missing this person as part of your buying group. Has anyone touched off against this role? Or like you said, gotten, multi-threaded enough to has marketing, complemented what the sales motion is to be able to get awareness in some of the surrounding part of the buying group. And so many interesting things here, which gets back to the question of prioritization. So Janis, we think about getting specific and the initiatives that you need to be selling your leadership on. How should revenue leaders prioritize their initiatives, and what criteria should they use?
So are you asking revenue leaders or RevOps leaders?
RevOps
or both?
leaders, and
RevOps
therefore
leaders?
how they should be convincing, actually, I guess, their revenue leaders. This is how, from an operations perspective, we should be prioritizing some of the things, right? We've been talking about really around some of this, common data, quality. I mean, how do you help folks frame, some of the key initiatives? And frankly, what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I loved your analogy about product and product management, because I think that you should run your roadmap like a product manager, which is very much like a double diamond concept, right? So you go out, you try to understand what is actually the problem I'm trying to solve. You think about the cost, right? So how long is this project to be implemented? You think about the impact, right? So going back to the KPI tree, you don't think about you think about real business impact. And then ideally you have so much, you have a forum with your executive team or your core stakeholders where you essentially prioritize and everybody understands that there are trade-offs. And this is how I think good product is run. And I think this is how good prioritization is run. And then, it's again, like you can basically have a long backlog. You can put things in selected for development, and then you can execute against it. And you have a specific capacity. And everybody understands that not everything is possible. And obviously, in product, you have the same as requests, because you have customer requests, you have bugs, you have certain things, tech debt, right? It is the same in ops. And you need that one view, or build up a help desk, right? Similar to product that basically at some point in the maturity, runs basically the bugs differently than maybe the new development. So obviously it depends on the maturity, but I think the fundamental logic is the same. And what we run a RevOps podcast as well, and we talk to a lot of RevOps leaders. And I think this concept of discovery, right? Like really understanding what the problem is, really trying to craft a good solution. Ideally, test the solution if it's a bigger solution, and then thinking about the prioritization on a line item by line item basis, but also on an impact basis. I think that's like the core fundamentals, and obviously that's also system supported, right? Like in product, everybody uses Jira, right? Like it doesn't matter what system it is, but you should have one. And of course, right, there's ways how you describe your tickets and your stories, and whether you use agile or different methodology. I mean, that's then all the details, but I think that general methodology to RevOps is really, really helpful. And yeah, happy to share a bit what are some of the challenges with that, but that's how we think about it. Yeah.
Well, it's a great framework, and frankly, it brings a lot of what you said together. You have you have your metrics or KPI tree, and when everyone's looking at the same tree, we're all looking at where the fall-off points are. Where is the greatest lift? Is it around more at bats? Is it around conversion rates from stage 3 to stage 4 because there's a fall off, because ACV is falling off, right? And then you can drill in to start figuring out where in the machine. Is it enablement? Is it because there's a handoff issue, or there's not visibility to certain types of information that then I can guide the sellers to help them make that point? And the RevOps team is absolutely well suited to bring this level of focus, and therefore be at the table when you're thinking about strategic investments in terms of how you're going to change your go-to-market engine. Although you're saying about a couple of challenges, give us the top three. What are the top three challenges for an ops person? Now they think about how they continue to elevate their role. What are the top three challenges that they would be in terms of setting up this level of prioritization?
Well, I think number one being, do you have executive stakeholders that understand the idea of trade-offs, right? I think that can be a challenge, right? Like I have a board meeting next week, stop everything and prepare the board meeting, right? Very common.
We've never heard anything like that. Never.
And I mean, of course, right? If you've been in board meetings, especially right now as like CROs, it's tough, right?
Yeah.
It's really, really tough. And I mean, if you look at the average tenure of like 18 months, right? It is a frightening environment right now. But at the same time, that's certainly one. And I think the other piece is like, so I think there's a question around prioritization, but I think there's another question around like, okay, how do you become a strategic partner to the executive layer? And the reality is, look, if you're 3 years in the job, right, like maybe that's the wrong expectation. Maybe that's not what, like that doesn't happen on product. That usually doesn't happen on engineering, right? And so that doesn't mean you can't try, right? Like if you present insights of what you just mentioned, right? Drop-offs, revenue, drop-offs, and so on, right? Leaks, to, senior stakeholders in the organization. If they don't listen, you might be in the wrong, organization. But if they listen, you'll build trust over time. And I think the great leaders will listen. They will look at it, and it might not change the prioritization, but it will help elevate you for sure, right?
Well, I mean,
and if you do this repeatedly,
to be that trusted person who understands the business metrics and helping the business leaders, the revenue leaders, translate that into how do I have to change my process, my systems, and frankly, at the bottom of it, they will probably never get to there, but really understand the data that's needed to make this all work. And this is really that that vaunted position that a RevOps leader is trying to get to, which is that trusted business leader that can sit besides the head of sales, besides the heads of marketing, to be able to give that independent view for the whole revenue machine. Janis, I know I could go on forever, but I know it's getting later over there. Thank you so much for sharing valuable insights. We've covered a ton today. To whether it's around this idea of data hygiene, which I think a lot of ops people understand inherently, but have a hard time to convince that or convey that back up to the business impact. And therefore, how do you start in different process areas, common data languages, and frankly, the role of automation that's needed. There's a ton of innovation going on now that allows us to collect a lot of these pieces, not only giving seller, giving a little bit of seller happiness, taking things off their plate, but actually getting to that level of data that can actually guide sellers and actually help drive not only better forecasting, better pipeline management, but that focus for the sales team as well. All right. But is there a last thought that you think about, Janis, that you'd want to end on, something we may not have covered?
No, really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And how are people going to find you? Is it LinkedIn? Where are people going to find you?
Yeah. So just type in Janis, like Janis Joplin, Zech, Z-E-C-H on LinkedIn. It's complicated. Or check out the show notes. And yeah, I mean, we create a ton of RevOps content. We have a RevOps salary report together with RevOps Co-op and a RevOps podcast as well. So if you're interested, just ping me on LinkedIn. And yeah, would love to connect.
And those who don't know Janis, he's a tremendous contributor to the community. We're all learning this together. It's a newer area and one that's having a huge amount of impact, especially as this economy is changing.